Thank you for being here. I'm Anya Landau-French. I am the New America Foundation's U.S.-Cuba Policy Initiative Director. Our initiative seeks to promote a policy towards Cuba that a little more accurately reflects and protects U.S. interests. We also publish a blog, a group blog, the Havana Note, which follows everything U.S.-Cuba. I think that we really couldn't have picked a more timely moment to have this event, particularly as we're all waiting to see what happens with the top kill solution in the current Gulf spill. But the Deepwater Horizon oil spill wasn't the impetus for this conversation, because whether your focus is on Cuba or on the environment or the oil industry, there are a number of us who have been trying to raise this issue for some years. And that's because the U.S. embargo doesn't just limit U.S. profit making in Cuba. What it does is it also hampers the movement of experts, technologies, best practices between the two countries. So whether you're for more drilling or less drilling, it's hard to argue that more access to the best technologies would be a bad thing. So a couple of months ago, Jorge Piñon, one of our panelists, and I were chatting about one of our favorite topics, Cuba, of course. Excuse me. And he said to me, Anya, let's write about this issue. I said, well, that sounds like a great idea, but don't we need a hook, a news hook, something that really connects this to what people are reading about every day? So a couple days later, I get an email from him that says, well, Anya, here's your hook. And that day, the president had just announced that he would be opening more offshore tracks to drilling in the United States. So, well, that was quite a hook. And we decided to write about the issue. We posted on the HavanaNote.com, our blog, a commentary raising some of our concerns. Frankly, we felt that drilling in Cuban waters in the Gulf could be on the horizon, no pun intended, and that the U.S. wouldn't be prepared to respond adequately, basically because of our own policies. So we wrote that piece 1 week before the Deepwater Horizon spill. Little did we know that would really be the hook to get people thinking about, I think, this critical issue. And I have to say, I hadn't anticipated the conversation getting started because of a spill in U.S. waters. I think most of us were thinking of this happening in Cuban waters, but here we are. And I'm glad that the conversation is getting started. We have an excellent panel to walk us through these issues today. And of course, you'll notice that they're not here next to me at the table, and that's because we have some PowerPoint presentations, and it can be easier, I think, for everybody to see the presentation, and we'll have each person come up here for presentations, and then we'll all get back together for questions and answers. So let me introduce them for you in the order that they will speak. First, Jorge Piñon. He's a visiting research fellow with Florida International University's Cuban Research Institute, and he's a former president of Amoco Oil Latin America. He and Robert Muse, another one of our panelists, have just co-authored an excellent and detailed paper for the Brookings Institution on this very subject. And they offer very specific recommendations for what the Obama administration could be doing and should be doing vis-a-vis Cuba right now. Normally, I wouldn't invite both authors of the same paper to sit on the same panel, but I think you'll find, as I do, that they're both indispensable in their own way on this issue. We're also very pleased that Brian Petty could be with us. He's an executive vice president of the International Association of Drilling Contractors, which is based in Houston. He co-chairs the Energy Services Coalition, which is comprised of companies and trade associations seeking liberalization of trade in the energy sector. His organization is hoping to bridge the knowledge gap with Cuba and has just received a Treasury license to hopefully make their first trip to Cuba, if I'm correct about that. We are also very happy to have with us Dan Whittle. He is the Cuba Program Director at the Environmental Defense Fund, which works to advance conservation of marine and coastal ecosystems in Cuba. Dan has been at this for, I think, over 10 years, and he works with Cuban scientists, lawyers, and research managers to identify and implement collaborative strategies for fisheries management, coral reef conservation, and sustainable coastal development in Cuba and in the region. And finally, we're very happy to have Robert Muse with us, and he is a Washington-based attorney who I think could forget more about the embargo than most of us Cuba policy analysts could remember. He has testified on Cuba before the U.S. Congress, before the International Trade Commission, the European Parliament, the Canadian House of Commons. I could go on. He's been a legal advisor to numerous projects dealing with Cuba, including for the Brookings Institution and the Atlantic Council. So I'd like to welcome you all, and thank you so much for being with us. I would say we've got a lot to pack in 75 minutes today, so I would ask you if you would keep your remarks to 10 minutes each, and then we can come back and have question and answer. Thank you.
If somebody will keep me honest on my time, usually Jorge Piñon tends to extend himself sometimes. I want to make a couple of comments before we move forward. Even though most of my career was with Shell and with Amoco, in 1999 I was in Mexico City. It was the time of the merger between Amoco and BP, and I was transferred from Mexico City to Madrid as a BP employee, and I retired from BP in 2003. So I want to put for the record that I'm also BP Heritage employee, and I'm extremely saddened and concerned about the incidents that is taking place in the Gulf of Mexico. I also would like to remind everyone that is this incident, we always also lost 11 fellow oil men that we tend to forget about. My other comment is that follow-up on oil and Cuba. This is a subject that Bob and I, who were members and are members of the Cuba Task Force at the Brookings Institution, picked up beginning in 2008. In fact, if you read the Brookings paper on Cuba of April of 2009, at that time, for political reasons, we underscored the fact that Cuba needed to be energy independent. In other words, if you have a transition government, or any government, whether it's the current government or a future government of Cuba, that is dependent solely on one supplier of fuel oil, particularly for 60% of their demand, that supplier has huge influence in that government, whether it happens to be the Soviet Union, whether it happens to be Algeria, Angola, or Venezuela. So I, Jorge Piñon, and a few others have been extremely aggressive proponents on allowing Cuba to explore for its own hydrocarbon resources, also for political reasons, because we do believe that Cuba needs energy to be energy independent in order for it to really decide what future road they want to take. So I just wanted to clear those 2 points up. I'll go quickly, if you give me a heads up. What I would like to do today is I'm going to teach you guys. I'm going to tee off some subjects of importance, and then maybe in the Q&A we can get into more details. Let me bring up the urgency of the issue. This is the Scarabeo 9. Scarabeo 9 is a 6th-generation semi-submersible. It is currently being finished in China. It is owned by Eni, which is the Italian oil company. It's a state-of-the-art unit. It can accommodations for 200 people. It can drill at 10,000 feet. In fact, according to our friends in Reuters and other sources, it is highly likely, even though it is not officially confirmed, that it will be in Cuban waters sometime this fall. The reason that the Scarabeo 9 is important is because it does not have one single iota of U.S. components on board. Not even nothing. There is no U.S. component on this unit, which means that with the U.S. embargo, as you know, you cannot have more than 10% U.S. components. The Scarabeo 9 is 100% British, German, Japanese technology. There is not one single piece of American technology or equipment on this unit. If any of you guys want to go ahead and pick it up for a few days, the going rate of this unit is $472,000 a day, about $500,000 a day. Uh, the contract is a 5-year contract. It's an $832 million contract for 5 years. She's reportedly going to Cuba to work not only for the company that's supposed to pick her up first, but other companies already subsequently will pick her up because really this is a very unique unit. This unit, by the way, when she finishes, if there's no more work for her in Cuba, is earmarked for the U.S. Gulf. But she'll have to wait 6 months because, again, the embargo limits any equipment that goes to Cuba. It has to wait 6 months to come back into the U.S. So she most probably go to Trinidad and Tobago to do some natural gas drilling work over there. But just to give you a heads up that it is highly likely, even though it's not confirmed, that we will have drilling in deep waters of Cuba by the end of this year. I'm going to let Robert Muse later on really address this issue, but you can see the complexity of our business. The complexity of our business is that geology, Mother Nature, does not recognize man-made lines and borders. In our business, we have what we call unitization. In other words, reservoirs sometimes cross ownership lines, whether they happen to be on land, two private owners, a reservoir crosses under their property line. It is common in our business, by the way, to do what we call, again, unitization. In other words, a reservoir that crosses under somebody else's property, we usually only drill together so that we can really maximize the life of the reservoir. But as you can see, this is the Cuba EEC. And there's about 112 kilometers square, the area that's within the U.S. Gulf of Mexico. You will note that this line, by the way, this line here, was agreed to between the United States and Cuba in 1877 during the Jimmy Carter administration. Bob, again, will follow up on that. It has not been confirmed by the Senate. But it is extended, and it is an operational agreement with an executive letter that is signed every 2 years. You will note that the two gaps, those are the famous donut holes. The Western Gap already has been divided up between the U.S. and Mexico back in 2000 during the Clinton administration, but the Cuban Gap has not. In fact, in 1977, Cuba and Mexico on a side agreement or a side conversation said, let's go ahead and wait on the Eastern Gap until later on. By the way, in 1877, the technology was not there to go deep into the Eastern Gap. So at that time in 1877, we were thinking, no way, it's going to be years and years before we can drill. So all that I'm saying is, and you'll see where I'm following up on this, Cuba has a wedge. Cuba will have a wedge of the Eastern Gap, all right? We all hear about the USGS North Belt Trust Assessment, which, by the way, is the most reliable piece of data that we have in our hands. And that assessment says that Cuba has somewhere around 5 to 6 billion barrels of undiscovered reserves. Please remember that in industry, especially for you folks that are going to report on this, that we have undiscovered reserves, proven reserves, and recoverable reserves. In other words, these are undiscovered reserves. And this is a P50 scenario. In fact, when you look at the USGS study, the P90 scenario of USGS is 9 billion barrels. So conservatively, we take a P50 scenario, which is 5 billion. We have to go now and drill and validate that that volume is there, and then eventually it will turn into proven, and then eventually it will turn into recoverable reserves. Those reserves that we know that based on technology and economics, we can take out of the ground. But this is the area. What's important is in that 5 billion barrels does not include the northwestern side of Cuba's EEC. Why? Because there hasn't been any seismic work done there, very little seismic work. My Cuban counterparts in Cupet believe that if you add this to this, that number could be as high as 20 billion. I'm sorry, I cannot accept that number because of the methodology. I'm from the old conservative school. I don't know what that number is. But certainly all that I want to leave with you is that when you hear the 5 to 6 billion, that is just the North Cuba Basin. That does not include the deep water Gulf of Mexico. What's important about that, and it's what Anya and I wrote about on our first paper, is that if you see the area that President Obama opened up, President Obama actually opened up the southwest portion of the eastern Gulf. And that was an agreement with Senator Nelson particularly, because as you remember, it was not only the environmental issue, but one of the main points that Senator Nelson had in mind was that the military training area out of Pensacola and Tampa Bay that is in this area. In other words, there's a lot of military aircraft flying back and forth, there's a lot of military training going on, and he felt that if we opened this part of the Gulf, it was somehow going to limit, because of all the structures and all the work, it was going to limit the military training that we go through. So what the administration did is that the administration opened the yellow area of the eastern Gulf. Now, I'll bring to your attention the gray area. I'm not an upstreamer, but what geologists say is that this is the area, by the way, that most likely has hydrocarbons. And as you can see, here's Cuba. And as you can see, here is the Eastern Gap. Now, one of the issues here, why Cuba and the United States eventually will have to reach some agreement on the EEC line, is that when you start doing seismic work, ships have to cross the demarcation line. In other words, a ship has to come into Cuban waters and come back and do this routine, and help me out if I'm wrong here. They'll have to come back up and down to do this whole work. Otherwise, the ships will have to come, turn around, and then this area will not be properly marked. And I know that I'm getting close to my time. Now, who's in Cuba? Quickly. First of all, let me the Chinese and Sonangol from Angola are in discussions with Cuba. So please, the Chinese are not in Cuban deep water. We already had that discussion with Vice President Cheney. If you remember a couple of years ago, the Chinese are currently today, as we speak, in discussions with Havana for blocks 19 through 22 and 30. And Angola's Sonangol is in discussion, for 16, 22, 24, and 33, which used to be the old shared offshore blocks that they gave back in 2009. Now, if you notice with the Chinese actually buffer the Mexico line. So as far as the U.S. is concerned, there's no problem. One of the things that Bob is going to talk about is that some people say, well, we still haven't agreed to the agreement. Well, all the agreement between the United States and Cuba identifies its demarcation line. But inside the EEC, according to the UN law of the sea, Cuba can do whatever it wants. And as you can see, the blocks that are going to be drilled here soon sometimes are these blocks. Most likely between 26 and 27 is where the Scarabeo 9 is going to go. And as you can notice, there are 2 blocks north of those blocks that are the ones that buffer the U.S. demarcation line. So if the U.S. says, well, we really haven't agreed to the demarcation line, fine. So we haven't agreed to the demarcation line. That's not the issue in this issue. 2 more and I'm out of here. The other companies, this is Repsol, Statoil, Hydro, and ONG. By the way, I know that the issue of technology, I'm one of those that always said that we have really know what we're doing. I think the BP incident wakes all of us up, maybe those of us in the industry that maybe needed some waking up. But Repsol just finished a Buckskin project about 280 miles south of Houston, and the Buckskin project was 28,000 feet. So if anybody questions the knowledge and know-how of Repsol, of course, their partner is Statoil Norsk Hydro, who has huge experience in the North Sea. These are 2 well-experienced companies that are going to be doing the drilling. That's another very important point. It's not Cupet that is doing the drilling. I want to underscore that. The international oil companies are the ones that are doing the drilling. CUPET is not going to do the drilling. So here is that group. This is Petrobras. This is Block 37 that Petrobras just picked up recently. It's a block that the Cubans have held on for a long time because it's just north of Block 7. So from a geological point of view, it's a continuation of the existing production, and the Cubans always kept it close to themselves. They finally gave it to Petrobras. This is what Petrobras has today. Petro Vietnam, Venezuelans have these 4 blocks. You have Petronas from Malaysia and others. Another issue that's important, if we're going to talk about Cuba, and if we somehow are going to restrict Cuba, then we have to restrict the Bahamas, and we have to restrict Mexico, and we have to restrict Canada. If we want to impose limitations on our neighbors to develop their own national hydrocarbon resources, then we have to do it with all. We can't just pick on Cuba. Well, let me check you guys up a bit. The Bahamas just awarded a number of concessions. These concessions here, south of Andros, follow Block L, 3, and 4 of Cuba, and the British and the Norwegians got it. Because geologically they believe that what we call the tail of the geological structure of Cuba's North Belt goes in this direction. In fact, in Cayo Coco, it was where Braspetro, the old Petrobras, drilled a dry well, if you remember, in the early 2000s. And I think that's it. Just to show you, and I'm sure Dan will talk about it, the importance, this is the line, this is all the sensitive area. This is of great concern for us. This is of great concern for us. And we're not asking of technology transfer to Cuba. Please understand that. I've been in meetings here for the last 2 days. I'm going out again today. All that we're asking, let me be very clear to finish. All that we're asking is that the international oil companies operating in Cuba, in the event of an accident, can pick up the phone and pull all of the expertise, personnel, technology, and resources that's available in the U.S., whether it's in Freeport or in Corpus or in Mobile or in New Orleans or in Houston, and bring those resources within 24 hours and put it to work to take care of whatever accident, God forbid, happen in Cuban waters. That's all we're asking. It is not Cuba that have access to it. No. It is the international oil companies that are operating in Cuba. If Repsol has a problem tomorrow, and there's about to be a well blowout, and Repsol needs to call Houston, and Repsol or anybody else, as we do many times in our industry, you pick up the phone, you get a helicopter, and within a couple of hours, you got that piece of equipment on the rig. That flexibility must be there. That's all that we're asking. Thank you.
Well, Jorge, you've stolen my thunder. I don't know what else is to be said. That was an excellent presentation. You've got much prettier pictures than I do. I am here representing the International Association of Drilling Contractors. We are the only truly global oil field trade association, headquarters in Houston. I'm here in Washington, directing the government affairs global effort. We have permanent offices in the Netherlands, in Dubai, and Bangkok, and we have chapters on every continent except Antarctica. We're a 70-year-old organization and represent virtually the entire onshore and offshore drilling industry, including Transocean. So we have some significant experience with all depths and all manner of drilling around the world. And with that said, we have always, as an association, been concerned about the isolation of Cuba, recognizing the inevitability of Cuba's exploring and exploiting their offshore shelf. We decided to start pushing our boat out, so to speak, and try to get in to Cuba with a license, because in various international conferences which we hold around the world, Cuban officials have approached us and asked if they cannot participate in these conferences. Can they develop papers? Can they actually join the IADC? And we've had to tell them no. Well, now we're hoping to change that paradigm, and we've got a paper that we've just produced, and I will read a lot of it to you if you don't mind. I've got copies of it out on the table outside. But it all keys on the Macondo incident, of course, as we're calling it Macondo, not the Deepwater Horizon, for obvious reasons, because we we think Transocean should be so far spared that blame. It's the BP accident, which Jorge properly identified. But as it has unfolded over the past 50 miles off Louisiana, has prompted renewed focus on offshore safety. IADC and its member companies are doing everything possible to support government reviews of offshore safety procedures and are recommending improvements to current operating practices and equipment via a joint industry task force, and that's with the Department of Interior in the wake of the Deepwater incident. Those results, I believe, are going to be produced tomorrow, given the President by the Department of Interior. Massive resources have been dedicated to containing the spill and mitigating environmental damage. The U.S. Coast Guard, Navy, and Minerals Management Service were mobilized, not to mention scores of private contractors deploying advanced technology vessels and equipment. These efforts were able to commence within minutes of the initial blowout, beginning with the safe evacuation of 115 crews off of the drilling rig. Now imagine if none of these resources had been available. An operator with little or no experience in offshore drilling is in charge. There is uncertain commitment to blowout and spill prevention procedures and little experience with state-of-the-art technologies or access to sophisticated equipment. Just imagine the scenario that would ensue, one with the potential to become reality in nearby waters just off the U.S. coast, offshore Cuba. This island nation continues to gear up for serious offshore drilling, including in deep waters in relative proximity to Florida's coastlines, beaches, and marine habitats. A blowout offshore Cuba could wreak catastrophic environmental consequences on the U.S., far worse than in Cuba itself. In late 2009, IADC submitted a request to the U.S. Treasury Department Office of Foreign Asset Controls for a travel license to Cuba. The intent was to take a delegation of technical experts to engage Cuban offshore regulatory authorities in a dialogue on offshore safety. The mission is to protect the U.S. coastline, Cuban coastal communities, and the Gulf of Mexico and Atlantic seaboard ecosystems. The goal of the delegation is to enhance the Cuban authorities' awareness of global standards and best practices. Key topics will include accident and blowout prevention, environmental mitigation and protection, safety procedures, hurricane preparation, and personnel training. Especially on training, the delegation will communicate the importance of competence assurance programs. These accreditation programs are already in use around the world to ensure that employees know how to respond to well control and safety incidents. An overview of the prospect of deepwater drilling offshore Cuba would be conducted, as well as a discussion on these issues with Cuban officials. IADC's initial request to OFAC in 2009 was denied. A second request was recently granted, and that was, in fact, curiously, just after the spill here in the United States. While the U.S. government was originally reluctant to approve the travel license, even though the trip would not involve any exploration and production, drilling, trade, tourism, or commercial exchange between the IADC delegation and the Cuban government, the Macondo incident has apparently altered their view of the importance of the IADC delegation. It is inevitable that Cuba will explore and exploit their offshore hydrocarbon resources, and it will benefit both the American public and the Cuban people to assure it's done right. It is urgent that the drilling industry, represented by IADC, be allowed to proactively engage Cuban officials on matters of offshore safety and pollution prevention. Fortunately, the Cubans are receptive to IADC's programs and recommended practices. In meetings of the International Regulatory Forum, Cuban officials have previously announced that they will require rigs operating in their waters to have a safety case done in accordance with the IADC HSC case guidelines for mobile offshore drilling units. Ironically, while IADC compliant safety cases are accepted by regulators in the U.S., until now there has been no move to require them. IADC has much more to share which can enhance the safety of Cuba's drilling operations. These range from the IADC Deepwater Well Control Guidelines, now under revision as a result of the Macondo event, to IADC's globally accepted WellCap training standards. Other IADC resources including expertise and experience in hurricane preparedness, mooring practices, and other global safety and environmental standards. All of these are accepted by numerous governmental regulatory bodies across the world. An oil spill would not heed the boundary between U.S. and Cuban waters. The existing trade embargo prohibits U.S. assistance for containment, cleanup, drilling a relief well, or capping the well. Due to the existing trade embargo, absolutely no U.S. resources can be committed to containment or cleanup. No U.S. rigs, only miles away, could be mobilized for a relief well. No oversight and expertise from MMS or the USCG can be committed. It is in our national interest to have a constructive educational and informational exchange with Cuba, and the time to do it is now, in our estimation. Now, among the toys and information that we're going to be taking down to Cuba, assuming we are permitted to by the Cuban authorities. Our license expires end of August, so we need to run fast and hard to get down there, but we are working on that now. We've got a suite of materials which describe our various programs born of international experience on training and safety. And again, Jorge is right that a reputable international oil company is going to employ the best practices, and in fact, Repsol and ENI are both members of the IEDC. But the Cuban regulatory authorities have to be up to speed, just like the MMS here has to be up to speed on what the companies are doing and basically shadowing their efforts, and are prepared to mobilize in case of an environmental disaster or safety disaster. So apparently these arguments have finally focused at the State Department, and it is our hope, as I said, that we'll be able to take a delegation, a small one, down there by the end of August. So with that, I'm just going to basically replicate some things that Jorge has already illustrated. As you can see, for the reasons he just gave, there is a clear opportunity for Cuban development offshore. There is a technical reach for that to happen, and it will be adjacent to U.S. waters whether or not the U.S. ever leases and exploits the eastern Gulf of Mexico. So that describes essentially what Jorge has already depicted. Now, just get hit on the right side here. This little button. Or okay. Ah, there we go. Sorry. It works, Anya. Now, this is an important slide. This is the infamous loop current, which we've all been hearing about in the wake of the Macondo incident. This depicts where the currents might flow in case of a spill in Cuba. And you can see the graph there, the red hash areas, where oil, if spilled offshore Cuba, could float and move, and right up the Florida coast, up to the Palm Beaches and beyond. And this is real. The loop current is very strong. There's little question that a spill in that area in the Cuban waters would get there. We're not yet clear whether or not the spill further north in the U.S. waters is going to migrate there, but we do know if it happens in Cuba, it will move in that direction. And there's no stopping the Cubans. It's their sovereign right to develop these resources. And again, this mimics the slide or the picture that Jorge just showed you, indicating where the opportunities are for offshore development in Cuba. And these are all within technical reach. And as Jorge said, they're in areas that scarcely 10 or 15 years ago were considered beyond the pale, beyond the possibility of exploitation. Now they're very much in it. And deep water drilling in particular, which is occurring in Angola, Brazil, of course the United States, and India, are going to enormous depths. In Angola, they're drilling to the seabed at 12,000 feet of water column, and then below that, almost to 35,000 feet. So it's a remarkable technology. The rigs are available, and they will be deployed, despite what has happened here in the United States. And the Cubans need the oil, and they clearly, as Jorge has established, are going after it. Now, this again is that slide that Jorge referred to, indicating the current development going on. And this is just, as you can see, just east of Havana, in areas that are just on the coast, and the trends go out, the geological trends that are oil-bearing. And so there is a launch pad, an infrastructure, if you will, for getting this done. So that is about the sum total of my presentation, but on balance, we're pleased that the government has relented, the U.S. government, permitting us to go down there. We have unique expertise. We don't have a brief for any other elements of the embargo, although it has clearly been a barrier to information exchange, technical information. But it is our hope that at the minimum, if we get in the door, that the Cubans are going to pay a lot more attention to developing a regulatory system adequate to the demands of this new program. Thank you. Just turn it off. Okay. Click it. Done.
If not, I can grab a map. Thank you, Anya, for inviting me today. My name is Dan Whittle. I'm a lawyer with the Environmental Defense Fund in Raleigh, North Carolina, and have been working in Cuba for about a decade with Cuban environmental officials and scientists on marine and coastal conservation. I have been in touch with Cuban environmental officials, scientists, and conservation groups over the last month. They're worried, they're concerned, and they appreciate groups in the U.S. providing information on a timely basis. I'd like to recognize David Guggenheim of One Planet, One Ocean, who's here today, and he has done an excellent job in communicating with Cuba through his website, One Planet, One Ocean, by providing constant updated information on what's going on here. I'm also glad to know and to report that the State Department, for several weeks now, has been in communication with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Washington and in Havana, and as I understand it, they are treating this as an operational matter and keeping the channels open and providing information requested by the Cuban government. Today I'd like to talk about some of the environmental implications of the, we all have a different name for it, for the BP oil disaster, the BP oil gusher, or the oil spill. I'd like to talk about the impacts in the U.S. that many of you have read about for sure, and about the potential impacts in Cuba if the oil enters Cuban waters. I'd also like to talk about what this means for U.S.-Cuban relations. I would be remiss as an environmental representative not to just step back for a second and say that this is truly a tragedy of immense human, economic, and environmental proportions. This is the worst oil spill in U.S. history and considered possibly the worst environmental disaster, single incident environmental disaster in many, many decades. The economic and environmental and human impacts will be long-lasting and very profound, and I don't think any of us can begin to know what those will be. In recent days, there have been repeated news reports of troubling safety record in the Gulf with BP and other companies, of cozy relationships between regulators and oil companies. Just yesterday there was a news article about the war between biologists and scientists within the government, and basically accusations that good science has been suppressed. And as far as I'm concerned, deep concerns over expedited and waived environmental processes, environmental reviews. So it's clear that we have a lot of work to do to get our own house in order before we go much further in U.S. waters, and I share the concern that other panelists have already expressed that if and when Cuba proceeds, we have a great interest in making sure that they do it right and learn from our mistakes. Let's take a quick look at the area in the U.S. that's being affected. I only have Cuba here, kind of Cuba-centric. But the Gulf of Mexico is considered, we consider the Midwest as the breadbasket of America. The Gulf of Mexico is considered the fish basket. The Gulf of Mexico produces by far the most seafood landings in the lower 48, worth more than $10 billion a year in the 4 states of the Gulf that contribute to that. The Gulf is rich with endangered sea turtles, marine life, a vast number of commercial species, snapper, grouper, sharks, tuna. They all live, feed, and breed in offshore waters of the Gulf. 90% of all marine species in the Gulf depend upon the coastal estuaries in Louisiana, mostly in Louisiana, but also throughout the Gulf. The areas precisely that are being affected right now. The Gulf of Mexico is also used by all 110 neotropical migratory songbird species, and almost 3/4 of our nation's waterfowl call the Gulf of Mexico home. And as I believe Jorge was saying, until the BP spill, most of us have been focused on what could happen to these ecosystems and the ecosystems of the U.S. Southeast if and when Cuba develops its oil and gas resources. Few of us had really been focused on what could happen to Cuba if it happens in U.S. waters. I'd like to just briefly point out that the areas most likely to be affected go from the Gulf of Guanacabibes here in the northwest all the way over to the archipelago of Sabana Camagüey. And all of that area is just extremely rich in corals, seagrass beds, mangroves, and in estuaries that are vital, just like the Louisiana ecosystems are, to fisheries and marine life in Cuba. We share many of those resources as well. Also, Cuban waters in the Gulf Stream, which passes just off the northern coast, is extremely rich in pelagic species like sharks, tuna, billfish, and the like. These ecosystems on the north coast also protect communities from hurricanes and cold surges, which are common in the winter. Also, all of these areas are extremely important for commercial fishing. Some of the areas are very important for tourism and ecotourism, bird watching, diving, sun and sand tourism. And I just found out yesterday that right about here, Ernest Hemingway had a fish camp, which is still there back in the 1940s. This area east of Havana, between Havana and Matanzas, is an area where all the eastern songbirds congregate at the same time each year to make their way to the East Coast en masse. You can see it from weather satellites. That area is potentially affected. And then the archipelago of Sabana Camagüey is a major tourism area and commercial fishing area. And we could go on and on. In the interest of time, we'll move on. The Cubans I've spoken with are extremely worried about what may happen. I think earlier reports suggested there was very little chance that the oil could come into Cuban waters. That's begun to change. The science is still up in the air. The currents are unpredictable. But there's great concern that it may reach Cuba, and so we're getting questions all the time about, what's the latest on the currents? When will it reach Cuba? What impacts are you seeing in the U.S. on marshes, wetlands, mangroves, and fish habitats? And what areas are closed to fishing? What should we do? Should we begin closing areas to our own fishermen? And most of all, what's the U.S. government doing to help Cuba? And I'm hearing from numerous Cubans who aren't necessarily part of that loop. Cuba has limited capacity, as has already been said, to address an oil spill of any kind, especially of this magnitude. They do have some success with the bioremediation and have had success on the north coast with using marine bacteria to deal with localized spills. So we all are debating what this should mean for the future, and I think we're in agreement. The Brookings report has excellent recommendations for what the administration could do in taking immediate steps in dealing with this crisis, but also preparing for future oil and gas drilling in Cuban waters. I don't think that this will derail Cuba's plans to move forward. I think it will cause many in Cuba to step back and think twice about how they proceed. I think they may be very receptive to technical assistance from outside on how to do it. But the environmental benefits are simply too large to step back too far, in my opinion. Their plans to develop the Gulf, by the way, are part of a much bigger, what they call energy revolution, which is very heavy on renewable sources, solar, wind, biomass, and even ocean energy, ocean thermal energy conversion. So I believe we have an opportunity. For 5 decades, we've had a very serious political gulf that has divided the U.S. and Cuba. The Gulf of Mexico has always brought us right back together. So working together is truly in our mutual interest as we move forward, not only, again, in responding to the spill, but in preparing for future development. I believe it's time for a pragmatic approach. Environmental Defense had a session last year in Brookings where we called on the Obama administration to depoliticize the environment and begin building bridges with Cuban counterparts. I'm not going to go through my list of recommendations so I can give Bob time to speak. I do want to say, in terms of immediate next steps, a couple things. One principle is that the U.S. and BP should take full responsibility for the spill and basically be available to assist Cuba in any manner necessary. My sense is that that is likely to happen. Number two, I'm hoping that the U.S. State Department and their Cuban counterparts will get together soon, not only government to government, but bring scientists, conservationists, and industry people together to begin a dialogue and to open those channels. And then lastly, I believe it's time to do a bilateral environmental assessment of these waters. When we do environmental impact statements, we simply don't have the information needed on the Cuban ecosystems to make informed decisions. And likewise, when the Cubans do environmental reviews of their plans, it's doubtful that they have the kind of information they need. So thank you very much.
Morning. I've been asked to talk about how U.S. laws, particularly the embargo, affect the Obama administration's ability to respond to this current event in the Gulf of Mexico. In talking about the embargo, it's often said that it prevents and prohibits the United States from doing certain things with respect to Cuba. That creates an unfortunate impression that the embargo is almost a fact of nature. It's something impenetrable and insurmountable. In fact, the embargo is really, with a couple of exceptions, is nothing more than the policy choices of the current occupant of the White House. They can determine, under the authority given them by the Trading with the Enemy Act, any president can tweak this embargo in innumerable ways. This leaves open to the current White House virtually any conceivable response to what's happened in the Gulf of Mexico. It, for example, can authorize U.S. oil technicians, environmental scientists to travel to Cuba to assist in mitigation or prevention efforts there, or even cleanup efforts if the oil actually reaches Cuba. It can also authorize the transfer of technology and equipment to Cuba, including, those of you who've been following the incident know they've been using a lot of remote operated vehicles, ROVs, to try to staunch the flow. The Commerce Department, again, at the dictate of the president, can authorize the transfer of the most sophisticated technologies to Cuba to, again, mitigate or alleviate the consequences of any spill in U.S. waters that may reach Cuba or in Cuban waters that may have an effect on their environment, and where we may have the technological capacities or expertise to assist the Cubans. So starting from that precept that the president can do virtually anything that he wants to do with respect to Cuba, why do we hear about the embargo limiting the president? And this administration's been saying it too. For example, in 2006, when Fidel Castro became ill, he handed over his powers of government to his brother Raul. This was under the Bush administration this occurred. A State Department official at a press conference was asked, does this mean any new U.S. policies toward Cuba? And the official said, no, as a matter of fact, it doesn't, because our hands are tied by laws that prevent us responding to these events in Cuba. That is a very curious claim of any president to make. And again, I reiterate, the Obama administration's been making noises not dissimilar at different times. Presidents historically have taken an extremely expansive view of their presidential prerogatives, as you know. In the Bush administration, they actually questioned whether we were bound by international conventions like the Geneva Accords or the Convention Against Torture, international treaties. So why in the case of Cuba are these strange claims made that we lack these prerogatives to conduct a foreign policy toward Cuba. And the reason I mention this is we're going to come back to it over and over again. It's a political construct that Cuba's passed from being a foreign policy to a domestic policy. And therefore, decisions relating to Cuba are not made at Assistant Secretary level in the Department of State, for example. They're made within the inner political circle of the White House. So think Rahm Emanuel and think David Axelrod when you think about U.S. policies toward Cuba, and think of their perspective. Anything they do is informed, or they're asked to do is informed, by what the state of Florida is going to look like in the 2012 election. And you remember that the Obama campaign barely won it in perhaps the most propitious year in living memory for a Democratic candidate. So with Cuba, we've heard in relation to this recent incident that the administration has done some positive things. Mr. Petty's organization's been given a license to explore with the Cubans safe practices in drilling. Dan Whittle has said that there is some environmental cooperation going on. But what I would like to see happen is that the administration go further and, using the authority they have, promulgate a set of rules that will set out preemptively or proactively that the United States will license travel to Cuba to assist in any mitigation of any oil incidents. And it does it now. And it articulates the category of that travel, which technically is under something called humanitarian travel to Cuba, and that includes environmental projects. Also, it should begin drafting a set of Department of Commerce regulations that allow for the temporary export of U.S. technologies to Cuba that would be used, booms, dispersants, submersibles, whatever's needed to react properly to any incident in Cuban waters or here that, again, may affect Cuba. I'm trying to think if, to return for just a moment to the political equation, and I'll be at question time. If anybody wants to go into the technicalities of laws relating to Cuba, I'll be happy to do it. But it seems to me, well, I know that legally the authority exists to do it. It seems to me it's very good policy to do it, to cooperate with Cuban, the sectors of oil extraction in the Gulf of Mexico. And then finally, I think it's good politics to do it, because in the first line of any consequences of oil spills in the Gulf, as was pointed out, the loop current in the Gulf Stream, bring that into Florida. And its environmental cooperation is perhaps the least objectionable area of cooperation politically between the U.S. and Cuba. The former senator from Florida, Mel Martinez, was Cuban American, and he was the author of a very punitive report published in 2004 regarding Cuba that tightened many restrictions, removed academic programs from Cuba of U.S. colleges and universities. Mel Martinez, though, said that he favored environmental cooperation between the U.S. and Cuba. The politics of it are inescapable. His constituents, most of the commercial and recreational fishing in Florida and along the Atlantic seaboard, as Dan Whittle can elaborate, spawn in Cuban waters and are borne up into U.S. waters by the Gulf Stream. So any environmental oil disaster in the Straits of Florida is going to affect Florida. So again, it's legally permitted, it's good policy, and I would submit it's good policy for the U.S. to take this incident and build on it and begin to think about what a set of regulations of the Treasury Department relating to authorized travel to Cuba by U.S. citizens and what a set of Commerce Department regulations ought to look like that would facilitate the United States getting the right equipment into Cuba to deal with such an incident? Thank you.
Well, I just want to thank you all for those very excellent presentations. And we have sort of a short time for questions and answers, so I want to be brief because I want to selfishly take the moderator's privilege and ask one question. And I wanted to follow up on the point, Bob, that you just made, that the President does have the authority to act. Our hands are tied until he chooses to untie them. And it makes me think about the fact that the U.S. and Cuba already now, I guess over the last year, are meeting twice a year to discuss various issues of security interest to both countries, like safe and orderly migration. So I'm curious what the panel thinks, whether or not we might see this issue on the table for those talks, which I believe could be set for as early as this June. We haven't heard any new news, but usually they happen in June and December.
I would think it's probable. I think it's irresistible. Why not? When you think of the contentious issues between the U.S. and Cuba, ranging from large expropriation claims of U.S. companies to issues of human rights, why not start with some of the least contentious things? And I would submit that environmental cooperation is probably, I can't think of a better one.
And we certainly have precedent with U.S.-Cuban cooperation on the environment, and that's NOAA and the Cubans cooperating since 1963 on preparing for hurricanes and natural disasters. So there is a platform already to build from.
Thank you. I saw a hand back in the back, Kirby, and then why don't we take a couple questions at a time and then keep going? So, and then you.
Jorge, this rig in China, I have a series of questions. Who is paying for it? You said there's an $832 million contract over 5 years. Who is that contract between? I guess those are the two major ones.
And the mic, if we can bring the mic.
Thanks. David Guggenheim with One Planet, One Ocean and the Ocean Foundation. Two quick comments and a question aimed directly at Dan Whittle. Dan, you mentioned the fishing camp of Ernest Hemingway. That was one of the places I was diving in November, and we joked that, or I wrote that Ernest Hemingway would still recognize that area because it's so healthy. And then also diving in other areas, Jardines de la Arena on the south part of Cuba. It's the true hot tub time machine. It's like going back 500 years in time to see what these ecosystems are supposed to look like. Cuba's ecosystems are incredibly healthy, and that is something that in our research together we are trying to learn from those ecosystems and apply lessons for coral reef restoration elsewhere. So this could make this tragedy even greater. The other point I wanted to make was that since 2007, I've been helping to lead a tri-national collaboration of scientists and policymakers, Cuba, the United States, and Mexico. Unfortunately, only NGOs represented on the U.S. side. We've almost got NOAA to the table at our last meeting in October in Havana, and we hope to do so in Sarasota. I'm sorry, I'm going quickly. But I'm hoping that this incident will allow us to take these dialogues to a new level and find that sort of U.S. government participation in a more meaningful way. And my question is focused on protected areas. Cuba's made a commitment of protecting 25% of its continental shelf in marine protected areas, and there's an effort by NOAA looking at called Islands in the Stream, in the Gulf Stream, looking at an international project to connect those protected areas as a network, as a well-designed network. Dan, do you think there's an opportunity here to bring this into a true tri-national effort that we really, should have?
Okay, so we've got 2 questions. What are you doing?
I'll answer your question, and then I'll have a comment. It is owned by a company called Saipem. Saipem is based in Milan, Italy, and is a subsidiary of ENI. And correct me if I'm wrong, but there's these drills, particularly now there's a huge demand for deep water equipment. In fact, there's a shortage for deep water equipment. I believe that the Brazilians themselves have something like 22 pieces of equipment on order for deep water drilling. So where before we used to lease these drills in short terms, now we're going after long-term leases. So this 5-year lease is trying to capture this particular equipment because of its quality and its technology for a number of years. But again, I can tell you that the ownership is Eni. Who is going to be the operator of the well that is going to report the drill in Cuba, I cannot share that with you. It hasn't been confirmed. We'll have to wait for the principles to be confirmed. All that I'm telling you is that there is at least 3 international oil companies in Cuba today that have concluded all of their seismic 3D work, and they know where they want to go for that first exploratory well. One comment following David and Dan, and I think that's important. We have had this conversation here about deep water, and I'm going to quickly get up because there was a map that I didn't show, and I wish we could place this map along with Dan's. Cuba is also drilling on its coastal waters, and its coastal waters do not belong to the foreign oil companies that are drilling in the sea. For example, the Russians, Savage Neft, has just taken over block Roman numeral 3, L, 9, 12, and 13. So the area that Dan and David are talking about, it is now in the hands of a Russian company whose only activity has been in Vietnam in the Tiger Field. So this area, this sensitive area that Dan is talking about, is going to be worked on here. In fact, there is seismic work going on right now. The Pinal del Rio area, block 1 and 2 are held by PDVSA. And block 3 is the famous block that is held presently by Sinopec, not by CNNOC, that people say the Chinese are in Cuba in Deepwater. They're not. The Chinese hold block 3. So just a heads up, folks. Let's not put our focus on Cuba vis-a-vis only deep water. Cuba is also drilling, and again, they just gave blocks 3, L, 9, 12, and 13 to the Russians. By the way, Petro-Vietnam has 15, 16, and 17. So there's also oil activity going on in Cuba's coastal water, right on top of the reefs. By the way, Cayo Coco was the one, like I mentioned earlier, where Petrobras had drilled before. So it's not only deep water Gulf of Mexico, it is also Cuba's coastal area that is being exploited.
You want to take David's question?
Yeah. Thank you, David. The question was whether there is an opportunity for a more formal tri-national effort between the U.S., Mexico, and Cuba to develop international marine parks, marine protected areas. And I think there is. A couple quick things. Number one, last year NOAA protected a deep water coral wilderness from North Carolina all the way down to Florida. Just a truly stunning, very deep water system of corals. It's believed that it goes into the Bahamas and Cuba. It's just a perfect area for joint research and eventually joint protection. There are also areas in the Gulf and in the Caribbean that would be perfect for international cooperation in protecting. I did want to point out that in late June, Texas A&M, the Hart Research Institute, will be convening a meeting of Mexican, U.S., and Cubans to discuss MPAs, cooperating on MPAs, marine protected areas. This was planned long before the oil spill, and we've just found out that we believe 3 Cubans will be receiving visas to come. And then, as David mentioned, in September, We have the 4th meeting of this Trinational Marine Sciences and Conservation Group, and we believe up to 15 Cubans will be permitted to participate in that. So things are moving. There's definitely a good foundation for it.
Thank you very much for excellent panel. I'm Najm Meshkati. I'm a professor of engineering at University of Southern California. I'm a Jefferson Science Fellow with the Office of Secretary of State, but I put my professorial hat here, no connection to State Department. It was fascinating, really. I'm part of a study group which is called Deepwater Study Group, Deepwater Horizon Study Group with UC Berkeley. And one of my colleagues, Professor Bob B., who is a foremost authority, you know him, in the area of offshore platform safety, has written a white paper which circulated among us. In this white paper, I have a last week version of it. He updated that last night. He says he studied 600 offshore platform accidents since Piper Alpha. By the way, I use Piper Alpha and Lord Cullen report in my class that I teach called Human Factors in Accident Causation. Out of these 600 accidents that Bob B. has studied, 80% of them were due to human and organizational factors. That's written in Bob's testimony. Only 20% are technological issues. And here is my very big concern. You mentioned, Mr. Pinion, about, I think Block 7 is with Petrobras. I remember the Petrobras P-36 offshore platform explosion, and that's not a consolation for me. One thing that I would like to bring up to your attention is when we transfer a technology, such an advanced technology, from one country to another country, we need to consider these human organizational factors, even at a higher level and higher scale. Would you, in your OFAC license and mission to Cuba, are you going to help the Cuban regulators? Are you going to help all these operators, Russian, Angolans, and that, to be more cognizant about this, that we are not even yet cognizant about that in the Gulf of Mexico? Thank you. By the way, this presentation that you gave, which was excellent, reminded me very much of the Chernobyl accident. I've been involved in that. I was to Chernobyl reactor number 3. That's really about the Chernobyl said a nuclear accident anywhere is a nuclear accident everywhere because of the fallout. In this particular case, we are dealing with environmental fallout of that in the water pollution and that. But thanks again for the excellent presentations.
Is that a question? Yes, I can tell you that our primary mission is safety and training, and it all involves sharpening the skills of the crews that are working on these platforms and rigs. We want the Cuban authorities to be educated so that they can backstop what industry is doing out there, but IADC has led the way on building a safety case, which is accepted all over the world, except the United States so far. I think that will change. Which is basically a check-the-box system as if a pilot was taking off in an airplane. And before he moves on, he checks the flaps, he checks all the electrical systems and all that. It's very much the same thing. And in many countries, it's required to be submitted to regulators so that they accept it, and if there's any changes ventured, they have to approve those changes. So it is exactly for that reason that we are engaging the Cubans. It's why that Cubans have come to us in various international fora asking us to help them with training modules. And the people we're taking to Havana, that's going to be their primary focus. Well, actually, it's co-equal with the environmental mitigation, but it's something we know a lot about, is training rig crews, because that's when you have the most dense population in an industrial activity, which is drilling a rig. After that, after the platform is built, as you know, there are many less people involved, but it's that intense construction of a wellbore is where accidents can happen, and you have to really be trained up to avoid that.
I think both Dan and David will tell you that safety, just like environmental stewardship, is a culture. And the problem with any of our companies, whether it's an oil company or any other company, if you look at DuPont and if you look at Dow, is the culture of the individual. When does an executive or a member of that corporation is willing to have the guts and the courage to say to management, stop? It's a personal. It comes to that, and there some of us, or most of us, I would like to say in the industry, have the courage and the personal responsibility and the culture of safety to say stop. It will confront you with the economic then response of the corporation, the executives of the corporation. You will have an internal fight or debate, but safety and environmental stewardship comes from within. Whether you are Tony Hayward or whether you are Joe Smith, the guy that drives the gasoline truck from Port Everglades to the local service station. That driver has to have the courage to say, I'm sleepy, I'm driving under unsafe circumstances, I'm going to stop this truck, this gasoline truck. And hopefully he'll have a supervisor that will pat him on the back and say, job good done. Instead of hearing the pain and suffering that he's going to get from the marketing group when that local service station in Miami ran out of gas. That's where it comes. It is a culture that you need to have.
I'm Molly Schwartz from the Science and Technology Policy Institute. My question, I think, is mostly for Dan, but maybe some of the others if you can have input as well. We've talked a lot around the regulatory frameworks in Cuba, but I don't really have a sense yet of what the regulatory process is for both offshore and coastal siting. What are their environmental processes? What are their safety processes? If you could flesh that out for me, I'd really appreciate that.
Okay. Cuba has a fairly impressive body of environmental law and policy that they developed since the mid-90s. They have a new Ministry of the Science, Technology, and the Environment established in 1995, and then a very comprehensive law of the environment called Law 81 in 1997. Since then, they've implemented scores of environmental laws, including two important ones, Coastal Zone Management Act that would govern the placement of oil infrastructure in coastal waters and areas, as well as marine areas, and a NEPA law, environmental impact assessment law, that requires any major development to go through a fairly rigorous environmental impact review. Of course, in Cuba, the big issue is implementation and enforcement, issues of everything from political will to resources to manpower, et cetera. I do know that over the last 8 years at least, that environmental lawyers and officials have been anticipating the day in which there would be oil and gas development in the Gulf. And I have it on good authority that there is a draft environmental law specifically to govern offshore oil and gas development. I have not seen it. About 8 years ago, I was asked by some Cuban partners to write a short paper on how we govern oil and gas development offshore in the U.S., and it turned into about a 50-page white paper, and I think I just scratched the surface. But they have a pretty decent body of law and just a very impressive workforce, top-notch scientists and lawyers, et cetera. So they have, the foundation. I wanted to just build real quick. I think there's consensus in the room that because the Gulf of Mexico, Northern Caribbean, and the Atlantic are shared waters, that we have a shared duty to be environmental stewards. But I want to also agree with Bob that it's now time to use the environment as that bridge. It's legally possible to do so now. It's good policy and it's smart politics. So I think it's time to look for policy stewardship as well. It's time to be stewards of good policy, which I don't think we really have been yet.
Could I say something on, it would be unfortunate if people concluded, because the Obama administration, in light of the magnitude of this disaster, has authorized what is termed meetings with the Cubans to discuss the spill at working level. That means mid-bureaucratic level. And it's no doubt going to be facilitative of giving licenses to Cuban scientists to come here and things like that. But I've seen in the past, if they don't move to codifying this and adopting a firm and permanent policy toward environmental cooperation, these things somehow founder later on political hostilities between the two countries. I've represented a number of organizations that have done work in Cuba over the years and had to fight with the U.S. government to get licenses for them to do environmental programs in Cuba because the interests of environmentalism were subordinated to a tit-for-tat relationship between the U.S. and Cuba. So unless you set this on one side, codify the cooperation, I'm afraid that the encouraging signs we see today, the disaster one way or another is going to end, and then there will be an incident between the U.S. and Cuba, there always is, over something. Remember the incursions of small airplanes, migration, something like that. And then we'll find that there isn't any cooperation on environmental issues, and we start over again at the very beginning the next time there's an incident.
That's an excellent point, Bob. And unfortunately, we have run out of time. So I just have to thank you for a really excellent conversation. You know, those of us who work toward a more interest-based policy towards Cuba, we sort of view this issue as a real no-brainer for this administration to get working now on. So I really hope that they will take some of the recommendations, frankly, all of the recommendations that our panel has made today. Thank you again.